go.
All right, here we go.
Recording started.
So here we are today with noted smart lap artist Jaap Hanekamp, who's going to tell us all about the simulated or faux crisis of nitrogen, the Dutch nitrogen so-called crisis that is making all the news, rightfully making all the news. And we're going to discuss exactly what that means. So I think we should start. A lot of people don't know a lot about the Netherlands and everything. So maybe if you
the Netherlands, everyone knows the Netherlands. I mean,
well, sing us a few bars of this smart lab stuff.
I hate that music. I'm not a big fan of that kind of music. I don't particularly like Dutch music.
Not even a
smart lab. No,
yeah.
No.
Isn't that, what does that mean exactly? Crying rag or something?
Crying rag, yeah. I'm not quite particularly known for the history of that type of song, but it's very old school. It's 19th century, 20th century. It's very, very. It's folklore. It's folk music from the Netherlands. Not a big fan. No. It's just singing bars, being drunk and stuff like that.
About cheese and canals.
Yeah, lots of cheese. Obviously, windmills. I mean, the Netherlands is famous for its Dutch cheese. I mean,
not
better
for much
than the
longer,
French
though. Not for much longer.
Well,
after the government sells off all of the farms or buys up all the farms under the strong arm of the law,
that's the big discussion. That's the big discussion right now. Well, we've been working on this topic.
Well, let me tell you first. Our audience doesn't know. They know me a little bit, but they don't know you. Jaap is he's got formal training in chemistry, and he is a chemistry professor. He's also got a PhD in theology, and teaches on that. And he and I have been working together on this so-called crisis, this false, fake crisis. I think. For a number of years, we've published often on this, and are still publishing.
8 years. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So
So what's going on today? So today, this so-called mediator or whoever who was once a part of the official panel to investigate the crisis, and then became due to some sort of bureaucratic trick and an independent expert today recommended that the government buy off the biggest farmers. What's the deal with that?
Well, I raced through the report, which is just out. Johan Remkes, mediator between Parliament, Cabinet, and the Dutch farmers, had to review the whole nitrogen crisis. Again, the Netherlands is a very small country, but the agriculture is quite big, especially animal rearing, milk production, meat production, and stuff like that. So it's agriculturally speaking, it's a big country, although it's a small country. So any kind of agricultural activity emits nitrogen chemicals like ammonia, NOx, and chemicals like that. And those are emitted, transported, deposited on surrounding land close by, far away. And the idea in the Netherlands is that we have too much of the good thing. I mean, nitrogen is required for growth. I mean, plant growth, nitrogen, that's, of course, heavily interlinked. You can't have plant growth without nitrogen. Farmers know this for millennia now. But, of course, we have a small country, loads of agricultural. So the government and House of Parliament and NGOs from the environmental side think that we should reduce our impact on ecosystems, nature in the Netherlands. Nature and the Netherlands is a bit of a oxymoron because I'm not sure if that's the right term, but anyway, I'll use it anyway. Because, as we all know, God created the world and the Dutch created the Netherlands. So nature is a bit of a strange thing. We engineer nature. We produce nature because of any sort. Either it's unintentional. For instance, all these shallow.
There's no organism or creature on Earth that does not reorganize nature around itself to suit itself. That's just the nature of being.
Exactly. But we in the Netherlands were rather exuberant in that arena. So we created our whole ecosystem around us in terms of cities, in terms of agriculture, in terms of any kind of natural area we might have is created in the Netherlands, almost literally. either intentionally or unintentionally. Anyway, that doesn't mean it's ugly. No, it's quite nice here and there. And there is sort of a very strong protective streak in policy saying we should protect the natural areas we still have. And protect simply means more or less the status quo, sort of keep it as it is, which doesn't make much sense, but oh well. So the weapon of choice is nitrogen. Now, there is a strange thing about this, because influences are from all sides, especially here. Groundwater, precipitation, temperature, climate, and so on and so forth, and of course nitrogen. And we chose nitrogen. So nature policy is nitrogen policy. Nitrogen policy is nature policy in the Netherlands, which is a very odd thing to do. But anyway, this is what we have. And
I asked you in an email when we were joking about this. I said, well, now nitrogen's a chemical.
Yep.
And NOx, where the X is a variable, is a chemical. And shouldn't the government be in the business of regulating chemicals? I mean, they sound scary. Aren't all chemicals scary? This one sounds scary.
Well, we have another policy in that arena, which is called REACH, which basically regulates about 130,000 different synthetically produced chemicals, which is sort of a completely overgrown piece of policy. And nitrogen or nitrogen chemicals, nitrogen compounds, nitrogen itself, of course, gas, which is quite inreactive. But yeah, it's sort of a chemicals regulation, quite massive so, because the Dutch government wants to spend 30 billion euros, which is a large chunk of our budget, on protecting nature via the reduction of nitrogen emissions and depositions. So that's it. That's what we try to do.
But why? Why do they believe that this crisis exists? Where I mean, they must have had some. I mean, of course, in the expertocracy, as I call it, they have solutions in search of problems. So, in my estimation, they have a solution. They want to meddle with certain things because of their understanding of what nature is and all this kind of thing. So they go and look for a problem, and they created it out of nitrogen. Other countries are using carbon dioxide. Of course, the Netherlands is in.
Well, the Netherlands does it as well. So we're part of the.
Of course, but why? Yeah. I mean, why this thing? And then after you answer why, then let's start talking about the research that they're using on this and the stuff that you and I have discovered.
Well, the why can be answered on multiple levels. I mean, you could look at it from a scientific perspective, which is not really that interesting. We're going to discuss this later because, of course, the problem we have nowadays everywhere is that science or scientism or expertocracy, as you always say, should solve everything and anything. Whether or not there's a problem, there must be some solution to some issue because of science or whatever. That's a huge problem in itself, because why do we think that science could actually do that or understand it or research it or fathom it to such an extent that we'd actually find solutions to the problems that might exist or might not exist? So the science part, we'll come to that later. The other part is harder to fathom. It has to do probably... Well, my estimation of the problem is coming from the 1970s, acid rain and the disappearance of forests, the forest dieback, das große Waldsterben, as they say in Germany, because it was originally a German issue.
Yep.
Actually, Der Spiegel actually brought out a huge paper with the title Das ökologische Hiroshima, the ecological Hiroshima, the idea that acid rain would obliterate within a decade every single forest in the world.
I remember that.
Yeah, you should. It was sort of the climate change catastrophe 101, basically. And that acid rain story sort of disappeared. It disappeared from view. People didn't talk about it anymore. But during that time of the 1970s and 80s, Dutch agriculture came into view because producing ammonia, and ammonia, of course, deposited on nature areas. And the idea was, okay, ammonia is, of course, a base, but it will acidify the soil, and that will destroy the forest, and that will aid the forest in basically dying off. So That's where it originated, basically. So it's say 50 years ago. But of course, the whole forest dieback disappeared, and now it's about soil acidification, biodiversity, eutrophication, and loss of biodiversity. Those are the themes that actually have survived the debacle of the acid rain forest dieback apocalypse. So that's historically where it came from. So, and it works because on the one hand, the whole dying of forests, of course, is very monitorable. You can actually observe that.
Yep.
It didn't happen, not even close. So they had to sort of move away from that theme.
I still remember pictures of monuments dissolving into nothing as if this has happened overnight.
Well, there was an issue.
They showed
with
pictures of algae blooms on lakes, and as if these are brand new. All kind of things like that. So they had the same sort of propaganda that they always have. All over the world, not just in Germany.
Yeah. And of course, the famous pictures came from Eastern Europe, where loads of sulfur dioxide from foundries, for instance, were blasted into forests. Yeah, and sulfur dioxide is not really a healthy chemical if the concentration is really high. Of course, most plants or humans or any other organism would really love to have sulfur dioxide blown in their face. So sulfur dioxide was an issue, and that has been tackled since then, which is basically a good thing. You shouldn't pump stuff in the air just randomly, obviously. But of course, the story got bigger and bigger, and of course, in the end, disappeared because the forest just grew happily through all our own brouhaha about all these problems. So, but what remained is the idea that ammonia changes soil chemistry, changes ecosystems, changes biodiversity, and that's a bad thing.
And it just became a matter of almost, I don't want to say theology, but it became a truism. And
it's a truism. Yeah,
and then it seems after that truism, they went in search of evidence in the form of models, and this is the stuff that you and I have done, in order to confirm their belief, but never with an eye to disconfirming it or testing it or subjecting it to real heavy criticism or real old-fashioned kind of scientific criticism.
No, I mean, maybe we should now slowly move to the science part, because nowadays any kind of problem, a scientist should discover the problem or describe the problem, explain the problem, and then of course propose solutions, and that's what happens everywhere, which is a terrible thing anyway. That might be a different podcast altogether. We should and must discuss this at length at some other time. Be that as it may, the science of nitrogen and the impact on ecosystems has been around now for the past 50 years, at the same time as the forest issue. And it never has grown out to be a adult critical discourse, scientifically speaking. Now, it's just confirming what the other guy says, and based on the work from some other types. So there's no real conflict, no real discussion within this discourse at all. It's just basically doing the same old thing and sort of publishing stuff without really critically reflecting on the results that came out of that research. And we've shown that, especially when we have to discuss the critical loads issue, the idea that beyond a certain level of deposition per area, ecosystems suffer from a certain kind of deposition.
So by deposition, you mean the amount of nitrogen that's falling on the land in the form
falling on the land,
precip or other ways,
precipitation or dry deposition or whatever you can imagine. Critical loads have been devised. The idea that above a certain kind of raining down or depositing a certain chemical, ecosystems suffer a certain amount of risk. That's the critical loads topic.
Now, you and I have investigated that quite thoroughly.
Yeah,
we did. Found it to be, at best, wanting.
That's being very, very euphemistic, I would think. Yeah. Because we discovered so many caveats, which are embarrassing on the one hand, on the other hand, sloppy, imprecise, statistically nonsensical, experimentally mostly badly done.
Well,
so there are numerous problems.
Let me just describe for everybody so they understand what this is.
Yes.
So they had this idea of nitrogen critical loads, and once you've exceeded a critical, you have to have in order to make a decision, you have to reach a certain point, and then we're gonna stop things after this nitrogen reaches this critical load. So in defining it, it's yet again the curse of the wee p-value. They went and did these experiments. Basically, they took small plots, just small plots, a couple of meters square.
Yep.
A couple of meters square for most of these experiments, and they would grow certain grasses and the like, or other types of plant matter on this. And they would measure all number of things: the rate of growth, the width of the stems, and the root penetration, any number of things. And if they tested a difference between something that had a higher nitrogen content than a lower nitrogen content, and it gave a wee p-value, well, that was said to be a nitrogen critical load. But there was no consistency in what they meant by a critical load, or what was actually affected. Or the range of stuff that could be affected. And they had these ridiculous extrapolations from a couple of square meters over the entire country using these kinds of things. So that we showed, if you just take a proper accordance with of the uncertainty you have in there, these critical loads just sort of evaporate. They don't become a thing unless you were to design really good experiments.
Well, we propose large-scale experiments. I mean, for multiple years. So you've taken a couple of 100 square meters and do this experiment for years and years and years, and maybe. But there is another problem you describe quite well in our paper. Is that, of course, nitrogen instigates change in ecosystems. Of course, it does. The question is that, in what terms do you regard this as damage or bad, or whatever term you might use? Now, that is not an easy thing to define, because change itself, yeah, sure, things change, but is that, to what extent is change a good thing or not a good thing, or is change in itself a bad thing? There are many different.
Yes, that's what they decided. Change of any kind was decided as a bad thing. Any difference between the sort of control group and the nitrogen group, that was considered bad. And which is ridiculous, because
another thing we found,
you have to have nitrogen. You can't eliminate nitrogen. It's an absurd thing to say. It's like eliminating carbon dioxide.
You cannot do an elimination study. In epidemiology, you can do elimination studies. For instance, antioxidants intake. Yeah, you can do that, because you can survive antioxidants intake for a certain while. But you can't really do a elimination study on nitrogen on plant growth. No, that's not going to work. But the other thing we found, and I thought that was great, is that there is always a background concentration in the atmosphere and how much deposited on the area you're looking at. And background is important, because you want to know at the control level how much nitrogen will rain down anyway. And what we found is that averages we're taking, yearly averages of whole slots of the countryside, which of course doesn't give us much information about anything. So you cannot really take the control and look at the experiment itself.
They would calculate these single numbers from a small area, and apply them either an entire region wide or even countrywide.
And then averaging by year. I mean,
these became the basis of policy. It's quite absurd.
Of course, there are other studies, observational studies, which are much harder to do experimentally. That is observing what happens to certain ecosystems in areas where there is much more nitrogen deposition than somewhere else. Of course, you can do that. Those studies are there, but it's hard to extrapolate precise information from these studies anyway. So this whole critical load debate is basically devoid of any critical reflection. We were the first ones, I think, that published a paper which was critical on anything, and of course we got no response from the community at all. Nothing. There was a weak response in Dutch in a internet forum, which was really poorly written and sort of a hand waving response. There was no real critical reflection on that at all, and we wouldn't expect that, because the researchers in that arena are not versed in critical discourse at all, as we are in chemistry and in mathematics and in physics. You have to be critical. You're critical of other people as well, because that's how the whole discourse develops. Not so much in this discourse, none whatsoever.
None at all. And so there's other things too. We can't cover everything. We have
No.
many years of study over these things, and we can't get into specifics.
No.
But they use this thing called the OPS model to drive policy.
Well, before we come into that, in fact, the whole nitrogen policy in the Netherlands is reduced to two things: the critical loads we just discussed, and Areas OPS. Now, what is Areas OPS? Is a model, is a transport model. It calculates the emission, or actually how much of a certain chemical is transported through the atmosphere, and where and to what extent it deposits at some point from the source where this emission comes from. Now, you can imagine, if you want to measure, analyze deposition in the Netherlands, you would have maybe 100,000 measuring points where you can measure different chemicals like ammonia, which is not possible. So I always say modeling itself is not a problem in itself. You have to model in this case, because you can't sample 100,000 areas in the Netherlands and decide how much deposits where exactly. And that still doesn't cover the problem. Where do all these emissions come from? That's another issue altogether. So modeling itself is not a problem, but OPS areas is a problem. And keep in mind, both critical loads and Areas OPS are part of the nitrogen laws in the Netherlands. So in order to define how much you contribute to nitrogen deposition in the Netherlands, you have to use Areas OPS, the model run by the National Institute of Health and Environment in Bilthoven. You have to use that model to calculate your own addition to the background levels of nitrogen deposition. So it has huge policy implications. Now, I was part of a scientific committee that had to sort of analyze the scientific quality of Areas OPS and all the other stuff. Not critical loads, by the way. We didn't discuss critical loads. Yep. But here's the thing. We never really looked under the hood in OPS. We never looked at the machinery of OPS. We did say as a committee, well, the precision suggested per hectare, the calculations done per hectare, no, they're too imprecise. That's the furthest we got with our criticism of areas. But then, of course, validation studies via a FOIA request came on the table, and you were courteous enough to look at these validation studies, which, by the way, we didn't get as a scientific committee, which still pisses me off, actually, if I can say that. It's sort of, as you know, as a good scientist know, science needs to be transparent. That's the a priori of any kind of scientific work. If you do stuff like that, people should have put on these validation studies immediately on the table. That's what you do. You don't have to ask for them. No, it should be there. Never was. Again,
that's part of questioning the science, and which makes you a denier and so forth. You're just supposed to accept.
No, that's not how I was.
Of course,
this
is of course not anymore, but this is how the expertocracy sort of works. But we did get these things, and we were able to investigate how well this model performed in reality.
You can explain much more than I can. What were the results? And of course, we have a two-tier approach here. The first part was our esteemed colleague Geesje Rotgers, a journalist in the Netherlands, also asked for the underlying data of these validation studies. We didn't get that, at least not immediately. It's a nice story to that. But the first stage of this two-tier approach was your analysis of the quality of the validation studies and how well these validation studies showed how well the model actually worked. Back to you, Briggs. I mean, what did you find?
Let me explain something about this model. It stinks. Okay, it's lousy. It doesn't have very good predictive ability at all. I want to explain this concept called skill, and I've explained it a million times, but it never sticks for some reason. I can't get it to stick in people's minds. So we have this expert model, this OPS model. It's all kind of science goes into this model, and it makes predictions of something like SO2 or NOx or something like this. And here are the
Concentration in the atmosphere.
concentrations in the atmosphere. Concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, that's a very sophisticated model. There's lots of code and all this kind of stuff. And here are the
before you continue, what you mean by that is you do an experiment. You open a bottle of sulfur dioxide or ammonia or whatever gas can be transported through the atmosphere. You measure certain distances over a certain time or over a certain time frame. You measure concentrations when you open the bottles, and you find certain atmospheric concentrations. And of course, they diminish over time because of convection, of wind, blah, blah, blah. Now, what the model needs to do is you have these data of these measurements, which has a certain precision, but leave that. The model then subsequently needs to predict based on all this physics and this chemistry, needs to predict these found concentrations you just measured in the experiment.
Yes. Okay, so these are anyway, the model's making a prediction. The sophisticated model's making a prediction of these numbers.
Yes.
All right. Now, instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the average, the seasonal average, the location average, whatever. I'm just going to make
experimental average. We have an experiment.
The experimental average. I'm going to make a guess of the mean, just the average. And I'm going to pretend that average is itself a forecast. So in other words, for every measurement I'm going to take, I'm just going to say that prediction, I'm going to predict the mean. I'm just going to predict the mean. I'm going to predict the mean. I'm going to predict the mean. Now, that's a really crude model. It's a very simple model. It's a useful model. It's a very good model. In fact, we use it all the time to say winter is colder than summer in the Northern Hemisphere because of these types of averages. It's a very, very rough and crude model. But if this OPS model itself has any weight to it, it should easily beat this mean model. Yes?
It should be more precise than just taking.
It does not. It does not have skill, and that's what the idea is. Skill. The skill is relative performance over a supposedly weaker model. The OPS model often does not have skill against this simple mean model. It just doesn't work. The error of the model itself increases as the concentration of the chemical, whatever we're measuring, increases. So in other words, when these chemicals start to become interesting and important, when they're just down and hovering around zero or some low level amount, the model does very well. Okay, perhaps.
But that's
when
trivial.
They get large and they become interesting, the model becomes worse and worse and worse. So we found all these kinds of things. And then, so that's it. The model just doesn't have skill very often. So, and a lot of times the validation studies
before you continue,
yes.
So reiterate, you've done the experiment. You measured a range of concentrations.
Yep.
Now you say a mean model, but you could say I take the mean of the measurements. So I add all the measurements I have of sulfur dioxide, and I calculate the mean, and that's a number, say 5 micrograms per cubic meter.
Yep.
That's what I found, the mean of all these data I gathered. And I continuously say, the mean is 5, the mean is 5, the mean is 5, the mean is 5. And now I let the model run. And you showed from the validation studies done, still without the data we didn't have back then, that OPS wasn't even close to that simple mean approach, which you can call a mean model, but it's just saying it's 5, it's 5, it's 5, or whatever.
It's still a model. It's a very crude.
Okay.
It's still a model. It's still a model.
Yeah. Now, what people think of models in terms of you have a computer running calculations on averages, but that's not the case.
I mean this in a more philosophical sense. This is to my way of thinking as a statistician. That is a model.
Yes.
The same kind of model, you could use the average temperature. November is coming up here. I don't know what the average temperature is in the Netherlands. 18, say. So you say every day is going to be 18, the high temperature. 18. That's just the average.
18,
now, if you can't find a model that can beat that, a sophisticated meteorological model that can beat that, well, then you shouldn't use it. It just has no value.
In terms of beating, I say the average temperature in the Netherlands in November is 12 degrees or 10 degrees, whatever. And every day I say 10. And I also do measurements, say at 12 o'clock noon. Yeah. I take a measurement. Now, the more sophisticated model should be much closer to the actual measurement at 12 than the repeated 10 I shout every day. So,
And this OPS does not. So that's one of the problems with it. The second problem is there's just not that much to it. Haysha, our colleague Haysha, ran the model for a farm at a particular downwind site. She had populated, what you're supposed to do if you have a farm yourself. So she populated this farm with 400 fictional cows, and then halved it to 200 cows, and halved it again to 100 cows, and then halved it yet again to 0 cows, and looked at the comparison of the amount of nitrogen that was deposited at this particular location, as you're
according to OPS areas.
According to OPS narratives, and the grand difference between all 400 cows and no cows at all was just under 6 moles per hectare per year. Now,
yes,
and between having the cows from 400 to 200, I guess it went down to like 4 or something. So we're talking about a difference of 2 moles per hectare per year. So now tell us, as a chemist, how easy is it to measure that difference?
No. And that's the whole point. I mean, there is a difference in terms of numbering 6 or 4 or 2, but of course, that's just completely fictional, because there is no way I can tell the difference between 4 and 6. I couldn't measure it. Keeping in mind, of course,
the model itself, here's the key point though. The model said it increases.
Yes.
And we can go down. We do increase. When you increase the number of cows, the amount deposited does increase. So based on that, if I had to make a policy decision, I'd say, oh, this is terrible. The only way I could do this is if I eliminated the cows or I cut them in half. And then the number does go down. So based on that kind of reasoning, well, therefore I should do something. But you're talking about a difference that's so down into the noise, you'd never be able to tell if you really reached it in reality.
No, that's I think our main criticism against this whole policy making is that it's completely virtual. It sort of suggests a world which doesn't exist. It only exists in the zeros and ones and computers, but it doesn't exist in the real world. And I think that's the biggest problem I have with the model, is that it's completely second reality, that the reality doesn't exist. It's just an imaginary reality.
Because we're already over time here. So let me ask you, did this new mediator or independent, pseudo-independent kind of a guy, did he take into account these kind of things, do you think?
No, nothing. No.
Criticisms? Or is he only just believing the science? This is science. The best science we have from the people who are, trusted by the government, and therefore this is the science we should use.
No. I mean, it's more of a general policy decisional thing. Arias is mentioned twice, only in the fringe, but keep in mind, and I couldn't stress this enough, Arias is central to the whole policy making. It's central. You need to use it in order to have an idea, computational wise, whether or not you add or subtract or increase or decrease your ammonia additions to a nature area close by. And that is, of course, very worrying. That's still in place. So our final conclusion was and is, because we're going to do a second installment very soon, is that this model should be scrapped immediately, because it produces bogus results. It's this very nice picture, is very, very beautiful.
It should at least be tested. It should be investigated and then judged by independent parties. Yeah.
Before it's investigated, it should be scrapped. It should be shelved, because it produces bogus results. There's nothing in there. So, in fact, the irony of this whole situation is that the Dutch institution produced mis and disinformation. Literally, we show that it's completely misinformation about the reality of any kind of nitrogen deposition from a certain farm which wants to increase or decrease its number of animals. Which is sort of ironic. It's hugely ironic that that's actually the case.
So now, where are the Netherlands going to get its food once the farms are shut down?
Well, that's a bit of an
what are people thinking about this? There must be having this thought. Oh, we're going to buy out all the biggest farmers, and we're going to force the farmers to cut their cows by 50%. Livestock by 50%. So, are you going to no longer export food? Or people?
We're a big exporter of animal protein, so to speak. So, we service the European market to a large extent for animal materials, animal food products. So we import and export continuously. It doesn't mean that, of course, now suddenly we have less food to eat. No, that's not how it works. Fortunately not. That's not how agricultural markets work, happy to say. But there is another problem, which I do not understand, is we have a war in the backyard. Ukraine, everyone talking about it. This for the US might be a problem more far away, of course, literally the case. For us, it's pretty close by. So if war would actually be extended to other parts of Europe, we have a big problem. Also, a big agricultural problem. So where do we get our food from? So yes, of course you can diminish your livestock. That's not going to change overnight the food situation. But in this particular case, this could be more worrisome in the long term than we actually might consider. There's also another problem, is that, and I think that's the biggest issue now, is that we sort of invest huge amounts of money to buy out all these farmers, and we have no idea what we get back for it. More nature? Of course not. We know this. It's not going to happen because it's a virtual world all these policymakers look at. So more nature in terms of less farms, more nature? No, that's nonsense. But there's another problem. Of course, that means less income for the Netherlands. Yep. And more unemployment. So it's a lose-lose-lose situation on all sides. We don't get what we want, and we get less. And we get less of what we do want is income and food, not just for us, but actually for the European Union and outside the European Union. So
what do we do about this? I mean, you and I have been publishing on this, waving our arms around, and trying to get people to listen to us, mostly in vain.
Well, what I understood from other parts of the world is that people looking meticulously at the Netherlands, what's happening here, because it's in fact a huge top-down policy influence on a huge economic sector.
Yep.
For nothing, based on, well, mere fantasy of apocalyptic risks related to nitrogen deposition. So we are an important country, although small, in terms of, can the Dutch government pull this huge operation off? Can it do that? Can it sort of, using mis and disinformation, which is literally true, we didn't make this up.
Yep.
Can it use that to force a huge economic sector down the drain? So although it's a famous comedian said, the Netherlands, small yet insignificant. That's true, but not in this case, because other countries like Canada, US, and other European countries are looking feverishly to the Netherlands. Can the government pull this off?
Yeah.
Because it's a trick. It's a trick to disenfranchise huge parts of the population in the Netherlands for no return of investment, nothing. So it's an interesting thing. So what we need to do, Matt, is continue our work. Absolutely. Because it's necessary. And as we already discussed, there is no critical discourse here at all. So we are the only critical discourse contributors there are right now.
There's not very many of us, that's for sure.
No,
not very many of us.
No.
Well, we should also say thank you to Haysha Rotkus,
yes,
who's our collaborator on all this, and she works like a demon, and without her, we wouldn't have been able to get anywhere with any of this.
No. I mean, she is especially related to the RVM. Of course, they in the end did give us the underlying data. The moment we published
after we published our criticism, they came out and we got the data, and they thought
within
they
the
had a
hour.
slam dunk with it. Within the hour.
Yeah, within the hour.
They thought they had a slam dunk with it, and then I was able to look at that data and say, "Well, isn't this interesting? You guys were doing it wrong."
So on the second run for this, we might discuss our new paper, which is coming along, almost done, and maybe published by the end of this week or beginning of next week. We'll see.
Yeah. I sent the draft yesterday.
Yeah. So, Netherlands important in the sense of, can the government do this to basically a free enterprise, basically an enterprise which is free to do whatever it wants within bounds of the law, and that's simply tighten the law, environmental laws, in such a way that farmers need to evacuate their own land.
Well, we got
that's interesting.
Just in the last minute, we've already gone far over. So, but what are the farmers going to do about this, do you think? I mean, they've been protesting this and shutting down the highways and creating a stink. But about this latest decision,
it's interesting to see the protests to be so massive, because farmers are independent people. So teaming up with other farmers is not really that usual to happen. So this is a relatively unique phenomenon, that farmers get together and protest en masse against these new regulations. So that's
well,
new.
It's been mostly the word from on high coming down to the farmers and more or less telling them, deal with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it hasn't been much
No,
communication going
of
the
course,
other way.
the mediator wanted to sort of invigorate proper and good communication, but I'm not sure. I've read the report, I skimmed it, but I didn't see any innovation in the report. It's the same old, same old. So
But at
I
least
don't
he said he
expect.
had tears in his eye when he wrote it.
Yeah,
Or words to
probably.
that effect. Words to that effect.
Yeah. So like a famous line from a song, much concerned but not involved.
There we
So,
go. We'll leave that as our wrap up right there. We've only talked a little bit about this. There's no way we can get everything in. We've got
no.
years and years of study on this, these kinds of things. So we'll talk about that in the future. But for right now, thanks very much for listening.
Yes.
And goodbye.
Goodbye.